There is a hill in southeastern Turkey that swallowed its own secret. Not slowly. The way hills accumulate soil over centuries. The way wind and rain and time gradually bury what they find. This hill swallowed its secret the way a person closes a door. With intention. With effort. With the quiet finality of something that has been decided. The decision was made approximately 12,000 years ago. The people who made it left no record of their reasoning. They left no inscription, no burial text, no carved explanation on any of the surfaces they had spent generations decorating. They simply gathered an enormous quantity of fill. Limestone rubble and flint flakes and animal bones and soil. And they packed it into the spaces they had built, layer by layer, until everything they had made was completely underground. Then, they smoothed the surface, and the hill looked like any other hill on the plain. For 12,000 years it stayed that way. Farmers plowed the fields at its base without knowing. Shepherds walked their flocks across its slopes without suspecting. A survey team from the University of Chicago drove past it in 1963, noted some pottery fragments, logged it as a probable medieval cemetery, and moved on to more promising sites. It took until the autumn of 1994 for someone to stop and look more carefully. What he found underneath did not just add a chapter to the story of human civilization. It moved the beginning of that story back by thousands of years and asked us to reconsider almost everything we thought we knew about what human beings were capable of before history, as we define it, had begun. The hill has been waiting 12,000 years for that question to be asked properly. We are still working on the answer. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. If sleep finds you somewhere in the middle of this story, that is exactly as it should be. The question is patient. It has always been patient. Chapter 1. The Hill That Should Not Exist. In the autumn of 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was working through survey records from a University of Chicago expedition conducted 31 years earlier when something in the notes made him stop. The survey, carried out in 1963, had described flint tools and worked stone scattered across a hilltop near the village of Öğrenci, close to the city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey. The team had logged it as a probable medieval cemetery and moved on. There were other sites to record, and nothing in those notes suggested that a second visit was warranted. But Schmidt had spent years working in the region. He knew the material. The flint styles described in those notes were wrong for the medieval period. They pointed to something considerably older. And the worked stone, described almost in passing, was a detail that would not leave him alone. He drove out to look. What Schmidt found when he walked the surface of that hill was not a medieval cemetery. The flint was Neolithic, consistent with a period roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, before the widespread adoption of ceramic technology in the region. That alone would have been worth documenting. Neolithic surface scatters are not uncommon in southeastern Turkey. But what stopped him was not the flint. It was the limestone. Large shaped pieces were visible at the surface, weathered and partially exposed by erosion. Schmidt recognized the profile of one of them with the particular recognition that comes from years of handling similar material in different contexts. He had seen shapes like that before. Never this old, never in a period when, according to everything the archaeological world believed in, 1994, anything of this nature should have existed. He stood on that hill for a while. Then he drove back to Şanlıurfa and began making calls. Excavations began the following year. Under the auspices of the German Archaeological Institute and in collaboration with the Turkish Museum of Şanlıurfa, Schmidt would continue that work for nearly 20 years. Through seasons of extraordinary discovery and seasons of painstaking documentation, publishing his findings carefully and revising his interpretations as the evidence demanded, he died in 2014 at the age of 60. Still in the middle of the work, still finding things that did not fit the frameworks he had started with. What came out of the ground in those first seasons refused to fit any existing model of human prehistory. The site is now called Göbekli Tepe. The name comes from Turkish and translates roughly as Potbelly Hill, a reference to the rounded shape of the mound as seen from the plain below. It is among the least dramatic names ever given to one of the most consequential archaeological discoveries of the modern era. What Schmidt uncovered, and what teams of researchers have continued uncovering in the decades since, is a complex of massive stone enclosures arranged on the upper slopes of that limestone ridge. Each enclosure is roughly oval or circular in shape, defined by a series of large T-shaped limestone pillars set into stone benches running around the interior perimeter. At the center of each enclosure stand two taller pillars, facing each other across the interior space, their flat tops oriented toward the sky. Some of those central pillars stand more than 20 feet tall and weigh between 7 and 10 tons. They were shaped by hand, using stone tools, by people who had not yet invented the wheel. The pillars are not blank. They are covered in carved relief images of animals, snakes descending in long spiraling columns, foxes caught mid-turn, legs extended as though interrupted in motion, vultures with outstretched wings, scorpions, cranes, boars rendered with a bristled, watchful weight that suggests whoever made them had spent a long time in the company of living animals and knew how to translate that knowledge into stone. Some pillars carry something more unsettling than animal imagery. Carved human arms, bent at the elbow, run down their sides. Human hands rest at what would be the waist of a body if the pillar were a body. These pillars are shaped like a letter T, but they are also shaped, unmistakably, like an abstracted human figure. Whatever they represented to the people who built them, they were not simply structural columns. They were presences. They were placed in the ground and oriented toward each other and toward the sky with a deliberateness that no one who has spent time at the site has ever seriously described as accidental. The dating is not in dispute among specialists. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material found in the fill of the enclosures has returned consistent dates placing the construction of the oldest layers at approximately 11,600 years before the present. That date has been refined and confirmed by multiple independent analyses over decades of work. Klaus Schmidt and the German Archaeological Institute published their methodology and results in peer-reviewed literature. The date is solid. What that date means is the thing that takes a moment to absorb. 11,600 years before the present. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built approximately 4,600 years ago. That means Göbekli Tepe is older than the pyramids by more than 7,000 years. The city of in Mesopotamia, one of the first true urban centers in human history, was flourishing around 5,800 years ago. Göbekli Tepe predates by nearly 6,000 years. The invention of writing in Sumer is conventionally dated to around 5,200 years ago. Göbekli Tepe was already ancient history when the first scribe pressed the first reed into the first clay tablet. Put it another way, if you compress the entire span of recorded human history, from the first Sumerian writing to the present day, into a single calendar year, beginning on January 1st, Göbekli Tepe would have been built roughly 2.5 years before that calendar started. It does not belong to the world of ancient history. It belongs to a time so remote that the ancient world itself, with all its pharaohs and city-states and trade networks and religious traditions, is the modern world relative to it. And yet someone built it. Not someone in the sense of a lone visionary, working in isolation. Someone in the sense of a community, or a network of communities, capable of quarrying limestone on a significant scale, shaping pillars that weighed as much as a loaded shipping container, transporting those pillars from quarries located hundreds of meters away without wheeled vehicles, and setting them precisely in the ground in configurations that required planning. coordination, and a shared understanding of what the finished structure was supposed to be. The quarries where the limestone was cut have been identified. Unfinished pillars still lie in the bedrock where they were being shaped when work apparently stopped. One of them, sometimes referred to as the Great Pillar, measures approximately 23 feet in length and would have weighed around 50 tons if completed. It was never finished. It is still there in the bedrock, exactly as the people who were cutting it left it, frozen in an interrupted moment of labor that is now 12,000 years old. There is something about that unfinished pillar that stays with you long after you have read about it. It is not a ruin. Ruins are things that were completed and then fell apart. This is something that was interrupted. The work stopped and was not resumed, and the stone has been lying in the position it was in when the last hand put down the last tool. Unchanged. For a span of time that contains the entire history of every civilization you have ever learned about, and then some. Whatever caused the work to stop, we do not know. Whatever the completed pillar was meant to become, we do not know that either. We know the scale of the ambition. We know the precision of the people working toward it. And we know that somewhere between the moment that last tool was set down and the autumn afternoon when Klaus Schmidt stood on the surface of that hill and recognized the shaped limestone at his feet, everything those people knew and believed and intended passed out of human memory so completely that no living person had any idea what was underneath. That is the first silence of Göbekli Tepe. A silence that old. And that is before we get to the part that still has no fully satisfying explanation. Chapter 2. What the Diggers Found. On a morning in the spring of 1996, during the second season of excavation at Göbekli Tepe, a member of Klaus Schmidt's team was working in one of the newly opened trenches when the brush in his hand revealed something that made him call out. Not loudly. The kind of call that people make on excavation sites when they need a second set of eyes on something they are not yet sure how to describe. Schmidt came over. He looked at what the brush had uncovered. He stood there for a moment without speaking. What was emerging from the fill was not a small carved stone of the kind that Neolithic sites routinely produce. It was the upper surface of a T-shaped limestone pillar. Massive. Deliberately shaped, covered in carved relief that the accumulated debris of millennia had preserved in extraordinary detail. Schmidt later wrote that the first full season of excavation at the site required him to revise his expectations almost daily, not because the findings were inconsistent with each other, but because each new finding expanded the scale of what was there in ways that no initial assessment had prepared him for. Every enclosure that was cleared revealed evidence of another enclosure nearby. Every pillar that emerged from the fill was joined, within weeks or months, by others. The site refused to become smaller or simpler. It kept becoming larger and more complex. The first enclosures to be fully excavated are now designated by letters. Enclosure A, Enclosure B, Enclosure C, Enclosure D. These four form the core of what visitors to the site can see today. Though seeing them now, with their pillars standing in cleaned and documented positions beneath protective shelters, gives a misleading impression of completeness. What has been excavated represents somewhere between 5 and 10% of the total site. The rest remains underground, mapped by geophysical survey, but not yet touched by excavation tools. That geophysical survey, conducted using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive methods, has identified the signatures of at least 15 to 20 additional enclosures buried beneath the surface of the hill. Some appear to be larger than the ones already excavated. Some show configurations that do not match the oval and circular layouts of the known enclosures, suggesting that the variety of what lies underground may exceed what the excavated portions have revealed. The T-shaped pillars that define the enclosures come in two distinct sizes. The central pair in each enclosure are the tallest. Sometimes exceeding 18 to 20 feet in height. The pillars set into the surrounding bench are shorter, typically between 6 and 10 feet. All share the same basic form: a vertical shaft topped by a horizontal crosspiece. From the front, they look almost architectural, abstract and geometric. From the side, standing near one of the central pillars of enclosure D and looking up at the carved arms and hands running down its flanks, the abstraction resolves into something else, something that looks back. The animal carvings on the pillars have been catalogued and studied in detail by researchers from the German Archaeological Institute, including Jens Notroff, Oliver Dietrich, and Lee Clare, who have published extensively on the iconographic program of the site. Their work documents the remarkable precision of the carving. The animals depicted are not schematic symbols. They are rendered with anatomical attention that speaks of long and intimate observation. The animal bones recovered from the enclosures tell their own story about how the site was used. Researchers, including Joris Peters of Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, analyzed these remains and found that they represent a wide range of wild species: aurochs, gazelle, red deer, wild boar, and various birds, consistent with hunting rather than herding. The quantities involved suggest not just food preparation but large-scale communal feasting over extended periods. This was not a place where a small group of people ate their daily meals. This was a place where many people gathered and were fed. In 2019, a research team led by Laura Dietrich of the German Archaeological Institute published a study examining evidence of large-scale food and drink processing at the site. The study analyzed stone vessels and grinding equipment and found evidence consistent with the production of cereal-based foods and possibly fermented beverages in quantities substantially larger than what a small resident group would require. The findings pointed toward periodic large gatherings, brought together at this place for purposes that involved communal eating and drinking on a significant scale. People were not just coming here to perform rituals and leave. They were coming here to be together, to eat and drink and work, in numbers that required advance, preparation, and organization. Schmidt understood, from the beginning of the excavations, that the site was not a simple place to interpret. Every element that emerged from the fill raised questions that the adjacent elements did not answer. The animal bones suggested feasting. The carved pillars suggested ceremony. The sheer scale of the construction suggested social organization far beyond what the period was supposed to allow. And there was one more thing. One finding that Schmidt noted carefully in his earliest published reports and that every researcher who has worked at the site since has had to reckon with. The fill that covered the enclosures was not natural accumulation. It had been put there. That is where the deepest questions about Göbekli Tepe begin. But to understand what the burial means, we first need to spend time with the people who did it. Because one of the strangest things about this place is not what was built or how it was covered. It is who built it, and what the building of it tells us about what human beings were already capable of in a period we have spent a very long time underestimating. Chapter 3. The people who built it. Begin with what the standard account used to say. For most of the 20th century, the period before agriculture was described as a long twilight, small bands of perhaps 20 to 50 people, moving through the landscape in search of food, building nothing that lasted, leaving behind only tools and the traces of fires and the bones of the animals they hunted, capable of art and language and complex social bonds. Certainly, but not yet capable of the kind of organized, sustained, large-scale collective effort that produces monumental architecture. That kind of effort, the story said, required agriculture first. Göbekli Tepe does not fit that story. The enclosures were being built approximately 1,000 to 2,000 years before the widespread adoption of settled agriculture in the region. The people who quarried and shaped and transported and erected those massive limestone pillars were living primarily by hunting and gathering. They had not yet domesticated the crops and livestock that would eventually define the agricultural economies of the ancient Near East. And yet they built this. The question of how is one that researchers have approached carefully, because the answer carries implications that extend well beyond any single site. Moving a pillar that weighs between 7 and 10 tons from a quarry to a building site requires, at minimum, a large number of people working in sustained coordination. Experimental archaeology conducted in connection with Neolithic monument studies has produced estimates suggesting that moving stones of this scale and distance could require the coordinated effort of somewhere between a few dozen and several hundred people, depending on terrain, method, and the specific logistics involved. Researchers, including those associated with the German Archaeological Institute, have noted that the organizational demands of construction at Göbekli Tepe imply social networks operating across multiple groups rather than a single small band. The exact numbers are debated. The order of magnitude is not. This is not a task a single small band could accomplish. It requires a network. It requires the ability to bring together people from multiple groups, coordinate their efforts around a shared purpose, feed and house them while the work continues, and maintain that coordination over the years and decades that building multiple enclosures would have demanded. Laura Dietrich and her colleagues have proposed, based on the evidence of large-scale food processing at the site, that this coordination was maintained in part through feasting. Large communal meals, possibly including fermented beverages, served as the social mechanism that brought disparate groups together and kept them working toward a shared goal. This model draws on ethnographic parallels from cultures around the world, where large collective projects are organized around communal eating rather than economic exchange or political coercion. The model is not proven, but it is grounded in physical evidence in a way that allows it to be evaluated rather than simply asserted. What it suggests is a form of social organization that does not fit neatly into the categories we use for either hunter-gatherer societies or early agricultural states. Not a tribe in the conventional sense. Too large and too coordinated for that. Not a state. No evidence of centralized political authority of that kind. Something in between or something genuinely different. A form of social complexity that emerges not from agricultural surplus, but from shared ritual purpose. The understanding of what kind of settlement existed at and around Göbekli Tepe has evolved as excavation has continued. Earlier interpretations emphasized the site's character as a pure ritual center, visited periodically by groups who lived elsewhere and returned for ceremonies before dispersing again. More recent work has complicated that picture. Evidence of occupation, food preparation, and tool manufacture suggests the site was not simply visited but inhabited, at least seasonally and possibly more continuously. The distinction between a ritual center and a place where people actually lived and worked is turning out to be less clear than earlier models assumed. This is consistent with what we know from other pre-state societies around the world, where the boundary between sacred and everyday space is often far less rigid than it becomes in more complex political systems. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitive in any meaningful sense. They were expert hunters who understood the anatomy and behavior of a wide range of wild species well enough to render them in stone with naturalistic precision. They were skilled stoneworkers who could shape limestone with flint tools to tolerances that still impress professional masons today. They were social organizers capable of assembling and feeding and directing the labor of large groups over periods spanning multiple human generations. What they did not have, at the time the oldest enclosures were built, was pottery, domestic livestock in the established sense, wheeled vehicles, or writing. The absence of writing is the deepest silence. Because everything they believed, everything they intended, everything they thought the carved pillars meant, and why they oriented the enclosures the way they did, and what was said and sung and performed during the gatherings that left behind all those animal bones. All of it existed only in memory and in practice, and in the minds of people who are now beyond any possibility of recovery. We can see what they built. We cannot hear what they said about it. Klaus Schmidt spent nearly 2 decades looking at carvings he could not read, in a symbolic language that died before any other symbolic language we know had been born. And he wrote about that experience with a precision and a humility that is rare in a field where the temptation to overclaim is constant. He knew the site was giving him fragments. He knew the fragments were extraordinary. And he knew, with the particular clarity that comes from giving 20 years to a single question, that the full answer was still underground. He died before he could reach it. The symbols carved into the pillars he spent his life studying are still, after all the years and all the published analyses, unread. And that is where the next part of this story goes. Chapter 4. The symbols no one can read. Put yourself in front of Pillar 18 in Enclosure D for a moment. You are standing in a cleaned and partially reconstructed enclosure on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey. The air is dry and carries the particular quality of high open country. The pillar in front of you is approximately 10 feet tall, shaped from a single piece of limestone. Its T-shaped top casting a shadow across the carved surface below. Running down the front face of the shaft, descending from just below the crosspiece toward the base, is a snake. Not a symbol of a snake in the way that a warning sign uses a simplified image. A snake rendered with attention to the way a large constrictor actually holds its body. The subtle flattening of the lower segments. The slight widening where the body meets the ground. The particular quality of weight that a living snake has when it is at rest. Someone watched snakes for a long time before they made this carving. Someone knew what a snake looks like from close enough to matter. And this snake is not alone. On the same pillar, below the snake, there are other figures. On adjacent pillars there are foxes and cranes and scorpions and boars and a bird that researchers have identified as a vulture based on the distinctive profile of its bald head and heavy wings. On some pillars, the carved figures are arranged in what appears to be deliberate composition rather than random placement. On others, they crowd together in a density that suggests urgency, as though the stone could not hold everything that needed to be said. This is what Klaus Schmidt meant when he described the site's symbolic program as coherent, not simple, not easily readable, but organized according to principles that were understood by the people who made it. The selection of which animals appeared and where they appeared and in what relationship to each other was not random. It was a vocabulary whose grammar and meanings died with the last person who had been taught to read it. The fox appears with unusual frequency across multiple enclosures, often in postures suggesting motion rather than the static profile common to much ancient art. Oliver Dietrich of the German Archaeological Institute has noted the fox's prominent position in the iconography of the site without claiming to know what that prominence signified to the builders. That restraint is worth noticing. It is the restraint of a researcher who understands the difference between what the evidence shows and what he might like the evidence to mean. The vulture carries particular weight in the imagery, appearing in contexts that suggest association with death and the processes that follow it. At Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic settlement in central Turkey occupied several thousand years after Göbekli Tepe, wall paintings depict vultures descending on headless human figures in scenes that most researchers interpret as representations of excarnation. The practice of exposing the dead to allow birds to strip the flesh from the bones as part of funerary ritual. The headless human figures that appear on certain pillars at Göbekli Tepe have suggested to researchers, including Dietrich and his colleagues, that the boundary between the living and the dead was a central concern of whatever was practiced here. Then there is Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. It is the most studied single surface at the site, and the one that has generated the widest range of proposed readings. A large vulture with outstretched wings holds or supports a circular disc. Below it, a headless human figure appears in a posture that some researchers describe as falling or descending. Other animals and figures fill the surrounding space in a composition that reads, "To modernize," as narrative, as though something specific is being depicted rather than a collection of separate symbols assembled on a single surface. What is being depicted is the question that has occupied researchers, journalists, documentary filmmakers, and a substantial portion of the global public since images of the pillar began circulating online. In 2017, researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis published a paper in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, proposing that the composition encoded a record of a cosmic impact event. A cometary impact, connected by some researchers to a period of abrupt climate cooling approximately 12,800 years ago. Their analysis identified the carved animals as representations of constellations as they would have appeared in the night sky at the proposed date of the event. It is a striking hypothesis. It attracted significant public attention and was widely reported. It also attracted a direct scholarly response from the researchers who know the material most intimately. Jens Notroff, Oliver Dietrich, and Lee Clare published a detailed examination of the methodology in the same year. Their response identified fundamental problems. Identifying specific carved animals as specific constellations required, assuming that the builders of Göbekli Tepe used the same constellation boundaries and groupings as later astronomical traditions. An assumption for which there is no independent evidence at the site. The proposed constellation identifications were not uniquely determined by the imagery, meaning other matches were equally plausible with no less justification. The argument rested on a chain of assumptions, each uncertain, stacked in a sequence that made the overall conclusion far less reliable than any single step in the chain. Notroff, Dietrich, and Clare did not argue that the imagery has no astronomical dimension. The site's architecture shows evidence of deliberate orientation, and astronomical awareness among the builders is a reasonable general inference. The specific claim that Pillar 43 encodes a precisely dated cosmic event is a different matter. 1. The evidence does not currently support to the standard that archaeological claims require. The position held by the researchers who have worked most carefully with the material is this. Pillar 43 depicts something that was profoundly meaningful to the people who made it. The composition is almost certainly not random. It may carry cosmological, narrative, or astronomical content. The specific content is genuinely unknown. That is not a satisfying answer, but it is the honest one. And the honest answer, when you stand in front of these carvings and let yourself feel the full weight of what is there, is more unsettling than any proposed decipherment. Because a decipherment, even a wrong one, gives you something to hold. The honest answer gives you nothing to hold except the carvings themselves. Present and detailed and precise and completely silent. Staring back at you across a distance that no instrument has yet been able to bridge. Schmidt stood in front of these carvings hundreds of times over 20 years. He never claimed to have read them. He described them. He measured them. He published precise accounts of what they showed and careful statements about what he believed they might mean. He went home at the end of each season with the symbols still unread. He came back the following spring. That is what it looks like to take a question seriously. Chapter 5. The Agriculture Question. There is a sequence that 20th century historians treated as something close to a law of nature. First came farming. Then came civilization. The logic seemed unassailable. Farming produces surplus food. Surplus food frees some members of a community from the daily work of feeding themselves. Those freed members can specialize, can become craftsmen and priests and administrators and organizers. Specialization produces complexity. Complexity produces cities and monuments and writing, and all the other things we recognize as the infrastructure of civilization. The sequence was presented not merely as a historical pattern, but as a logical necessity. You cannot have the second thing without the first. Göbekli Tepe does not fit this sequence. It fits the sequence backwards. The enclosures were being built before large-scale settled agriculture existed in the region. The people who built them had not yet domesticated the crops and livestock that would eventually define the agricultural economies of the ancient Near East. And yet here they were, organizing collective labor on a scale that the standard model said required agriculture as a precondition, building something that required feeding large numbers of people over extended periods, maintaining a site of remarkable complexity across multiple human generations. Which raises a question that goes to the heart of how we understand our own history. What if the sequence is wrong? What if agriculture did not produce the social complexity that made monumental construction possible? What if monumental construction, and the social organization it required, helped produce the conditions that led to agriculture? This is not a fringe hypothesis. It is a serious scholarly proposal with a growing body of evidence behind it. Developed primarily by researchers working directly with the material at Göbekli Tepe and related sites, the argument runs as follows. Building and maintaining a site like Göbekli Tepe required bringing large numbers of people together periodically and keeping them fed while they worked. The wild resources of the surrounding landscape, however rich, would have been under significant pressure from concentrated demand. People organizing large work parties and large feasts would have had strong practical incentives to find more reliable ways of producing food in larger quantities than purely opportunistic hunting and gathering allowed. That pressure, repeated over generations, every season when the gatherings happened and the mouths to feed multiplied, may have been exactly the kind of sustained demand that drives the transition from harvesting wild plants to cultivating domestic ones. The evidence for this argument is not merely theoretical. The area around Göbekli Tepe lies within the core zone of wild einkorn wheat, one of the founding crops of Near Eastern agriculture. Genetic research tracing the domestication of einkorn wheat, including work by Hoon and colleagues published in Science in 1997 and refined by subsequent studies, has pointed to an origin zone in the Karadag Mountains, which lie within approximately 20 miles of the site. The proximity does not prove a causal connection. Proximity is not causation, and a responsible account of the evidence has to hold that distinction clearly. But it is a data point that sits comfortably within the theory that the organizational demands of Göbekli Tepe contributed to the conditions that produced agriculture in the region. The 2019 study by Laura Dietrich and colleagues at the German Archaeological Institute added a significant piece to this picture. Their analysis of stone vessels and grinding equipment found evidence of large-scale cereal processing at quantities consistent with large communal gatherings rather than small resident groups. This was not household cooking. This was food production at an institutional scale, organized to feed the labor forces and gathered communities the site required. The cereals being processed were wild, or transitional between wild and domestic, at the earliest phases of occupation. But processing wild cereals in large quantities, season after season, at a fixed location, is itself a practice that creates selection pressure toward domestication. Plants whose seeds are easier to harvest and more productive per unit of effort are the ones that thrive when humans are harvesting them systematically rather than opportunistically. The practice of intensive wild cereal processing is not separated from agriculture by a clean line. It is part of the same continuum of human and plant interaction that, over generations, produces domestic crops. The researchers whose work has been most important in developing this understanding include Laura Dietrich and Oliver Dietrich, Jens Notroff, and Lee Clare at the German Archaeological Institute. alongside Joris Peters at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Their collective work has produced a picture of Göbekli Tepe that is more integrated and more dynamic than earlier models allowed. The site was not a ritual center standing apart from the practical concerns of daily life. It was a place where the demands of ceremony and construction drove the development of new ways of producing food, where the social organization required for building created conditions for the agricultural transition, where the sequence that 20th century historians treated as a logical necessity may have run, at least in part, the other way. This does not mean the standard account is entirely wrong. Agriculture and civilization are still deeply connected. The transition to farming still produced the surplus that eventually funded cities and states and writing systems, but the question of what caused the agricultural transition is different from the question of what agriculture subsequently made possible. And Göbekli Tepe suggests that the answer to the first question involves ritual, ceremony, and the organizational demands of communal monument building in ways the standard model never anticipated. There are sites across southeastern Turkey and northern Syria that share characteristics with Göbekli Tepe. Karahan Tepe, Taş Tepeler, Nevalıçori. These sites have produced T-shaped pillars and carved imagery in the same broad period, suggesting that Göbekli Tepe was not a unique anomaly, but the most spectacular surviving example of a pattern of monumental construction that was more widespread than anyone suspected before the excavations began. How widespread that pattern was. How many sites of this type remain undiscovered beneath the landscapes of the ancient Near East is a question current archaeology cannot yet fully answer. What the pattern suggests is that the world of 12,000 years ago was more organized, more socially complex, and more capable of sustained collective effort than the world our history books described. Klaus Schmidt understood this from early in the excavations. He wrote about it carefully, always marking what the evidence supported and what it did not yet reach. He knew that the implications of what he was finding extended far beyond the hill above the Harran Plain, far beyond the question of when agriculture began or how complex pre-agricultural societies could become. He knew, because he had spent years looking at the evidence, that the people who built Göbekli Tepe had made a decision that was in some ways even more remarkable than the decision to build it. They had decided, at some point, to cover it completely, to take everything they had made, everything they had maintained across generations, and put it back into the ground. That decision is where this story has been heading since the beginning. And understanding it requires sitting with a number that the human mind was not built to hold. Chapter 6. The Deliberate Burial. The phrase, deliberately buried, appears in the early literature on Göbekli Tepe with a confidence that subsequent research has both confirmed and complicated. Confirmed, because the basic finding is solid. The fill that covers the enclosures is not natural accumulation. It does not have the sorted, banded profile that centuries of windblown soil and eroded material produce. It is mixed, unsorted, composed of limestone rubble and flint flakes and animal bones and soil in a combination that is characteristic of material gathered from the surface of an occupied site and deposited in bulk. Klaus Schmidt noted this in his earliest published reports. Every researcher who has worked the stratigraphy since has reached the same basic conclusion. The fill was brought here and placed here. Complicated, because the process that produced that fill was almost certainly not the single decisive act that the phrase deliberately buried tends to imply. Jens Notroff and Oliver Dietrich, writing in the years after Schmidt's death, have been careful to describe the filling of the enclosures as a process whose full character is still being understood. Different enclosures appear to have been filled at different times. Some deposits within the fill suggest gradual accumulation over extended periods. Others appear more concentrated, more purposeful in their placement. What emerges from this more nuanced picture is not a moment of burial but something more interesting and more difficult to name. A practice, perhaps. A way of relating to the structures that had been built and used and were now being retired from active use. Carried out over time. By multiple generations. In ways that may have varied between enclosures and between periods. The result, whatever the precise nature of the process, was the same. Everything was covered. Completely. The tallest pillars. The carved surfaces. The stone benches. The central pairs facing each other across the interior spaces of each enclosure. All of it went underground. And the hill above the Heron Plain acquired the rounded, unremarkable shape that would mislead every observer for the next 12,000 years. To understand what that covering meant, it helps to stand inside one of the excavated enclosures and try to imagine the moment before the fill began to arrive. You are standing in enclosure D. The two central pillars rise above you, their carved arms running down their flanks, their flat tops catching the sky. The shorter pillars in the surrounding bench face inward. The animal carvings on every surface are in the full presence of whatever light and weather the seasons brought. This space has been used for ceremonies you cannot name, for gatherings that left behind the bones of hundreds of animals consumed over years or decades of collective feasting, for whatever transactions of meaning and memory and community the carved figures were part of. And now, someone has decided it is time. The first basket of fill arrives. Then another. Then another. Over days or weeks or months or longer, the fill accumulates. The carved surfaces disappear beneath it. The shorter pillars are swallowed first. Then the taller ones. Gradually, methodically, with the same organized effort that built the enclosure in the first place. The space is returned to the earth. Several researchers have proposed frameworks for understanding why. Some have suggested ritual closure, the ceremonial ending of a space understood to have a finite lifespan, a dignified death for a structure that had served its purpose. The parallel with the Cucuteni Tripilia culture of prehistoric Eastern Europe, which built some of the largest settlements of the Neolithic world and then burned them deliberately every 60 to 80 years, has been noted as a possible conceptual analog. Though the two cultures had no documented connection and the comparison should be held loosely, others have proposed practical explanations. After decades of use, structures accumulate damage and structural weakness. Covering the old and building nearby may have been the most practical response to deterioration available to communities without the materials or methods for large-scale repair. A third possibility, raised by researchers including those at the German Archaeological Institute without being fully endorsed, connects the filling to the transition toward a more settled way of life. If the communities that used Göbekli Tepe were shifting toward agriculture and fixed settlement, the ritual center that had organized their previous existence may have been deliberately closed as a way of marking that passage, ending one world before beginning another. Each framework fits part of the evidence. None fits all of it. The honest researchers say so. But here is what all of those frameworks share, and what the evidence, taken in its full complexity, consistently points toward. The covering was a choice. Not an accident. Not a response to catastrophe. Not a panicked concealment of sacred things in the face of an approaching threat. A choice, made by people who understood what they were covering, carried out with the same organized purpose that had built the enclosures in the first place. Now hold that choice alongside something that those people could not possibly have known. The covering that ended the active life of Göbekli Tepe is also the reason Göbekli Tepe survived. 12,000 years of weathering and erosion would have worked differently on exposed stone than on buried stone. The precision of the carvings, the fine detail of the snake scales and the fox's mid-turn posture and the carved arms on the flanks of the central pillars of enclosure D. All of it survived because it was underground. The same fill that silenced the site preserved it. The act of ending became, across a span of time no one involved could have imagined, the act of preservation. This is where the phrase in the title of this story requires its honest accounting. The words 10,000 years in advance are not a claim that the people who filled the enclosures knew, in any conscious or deliberate sense, that they were creating a time capsule. They had no concept of 12,000 years. They had no way of imagining the sequence of civilizations that would rise and fall on the plain below their hill while the fill held what they had made in the dark. They did not know about Klaus Schmidt, or radiocarbon dating, or peer-reviewed journals, or any of the mechanisms by which their decision would eventually come to matter to people living in a world they could not have conceived. What they had was a practice, and what that practice produced, across a distance of time that dwarfs the entire span of recorded history, was consequence rather than intention. The consequence is that we found it. The consequence is that the carvings are still precise. The consequence is that the question those people placed in the ground is still intact, still legible in the only language that could survive that long, the language of stone and scale and human effort, still waiting for whoever would eventually be standing on that hill with the tools and the patience to receive it. We are the ones standing on that hill. We receive the question. We are still working on what it means. Chapter 7. What 12,000 years looks like. Stop for a moment and try to feel the number. Not think about it. Feel it. 12,000 years. The exercise is harder than it sounds. The human mind was not built to hold numbers like that in any experiential sense. We can say it. We can place it on a timeline. We can do the arithmetic that shows it is older than the pyramids by 7,000 years and older than Sumerian writing by nearly 7,000 more. But the actual felt weight of that span, the living reality of what it contains, and what it erases, and what it changes so completely that nothing on the other side is recognizable from this side, resists the imagination the way deep water resists the eye. Let us try anyway. You are living now, in whatever year you are hearing this, in a world shaped by the last few centuries of recorded history. The oldest continuous political institutions in the world are perhaps a few hundred years old. The oldest living languages in active daily use trace back perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 years in any recognizable form. The oldest texts that a modern reader could engage with difficulty, with translation, with scholarly assistance, are perhaps 5,000 years old. 5,000 years is already at the edge of what most people can hold as something real rather than abstract. That far back, the people who lived then feel genuinely distant. Their concerns and cosmologies separated from ours by so much accumulated change that direct imaginative connection requires effort. Göbekli Tepe was already 5,000 years old when those texts were written. When the first Sumerian scribe pressed a reed into clay and made the marks that would become the oldest writing system we know, the enclosures on the hill above the Harran Plain had already been underground for 5,000 years. The people who built them were as remote from that scribe as that scribe is from us. The builders of Göbekli Tepe are not in the ancient world. They are before it. They are in a time so remote that the ancient world itself, with all its pharaohs and city-states and trade networks and accumulated wisdom, is the modern world relative to them. Here is another way to feel the distance. The last woolly mammoths in the world died approximately 4,000 years ago, roughly contemporary with the construction of Stonehenge. The great herds that roamed the steppes of Eurasia went extinct closer to 10,000 years ago, when the builders of Göbekli Tepe were carrying their limestone pillars up the ridge above the Harran Plain. Mammoths were still alive somewhere in the world. Not the great herds of the Ice Age, but alive. The world in which this hill was built and used and covered was a world that still contained mammoths. That is the distance. Now hold that distance and consider what it means for the people who carried out the filling. When the last basket of fill was emptied and the surface was smoothed and the hill assumed the shape it would keep, the people who had done that work had no possible way of knowing what would come after them. They did not know that agriculture would transform the landscape they lived in within a few generations. They did not know that cities would rise in the river valleys to the south and east, that those cities would produce writing and law and trade networks of a kind that would eventually be called civilization. They did not know about Egypt, or Greece, or Rome. They did not know about the Arabic language that would one day give this region its name. They did not know about the Ottoman Empire that would one day claim this territory, or the Turkish Republic that would one day protect this hill with UNESCO designation. They did not know about Klaus Schmidt. They knew their world. They knew the hill and the plain, and the animals on the limestone, and the seasons that brought their people together, and the ceremonies whose meaning they had learned from their parents and would teach to their children. And then they covered their most important place, for reasons that made complete sense in that world. And the hill held what they had made through everything that came after. This is the part that does not release its hold once you have really sat with it. Empires rose and fell on the plain below that hill. Languages were born and died within earshot of it. Religions that could not have been imagined by the people who built it spread across the region and left their own marks on the landscape. Wars were fought. Cities were built and abandoned. The climate shifted, warmed, cooled, shifted again. And, underneath all of it, in the dark, in the perfect patience of stone, the carvings waited. The fox stayed frozen mid-turn on its pillar. The snakes descended their limestone columns in the same patient spirals. The carved arms on the flanks of the central pillars of enclosure D held their position through a span of time that contains the entire recorded history of the human species more than twice over. Not as a metaphor. As a physical fact, those pillars are still there. You can stand next to them. You can put your hand on stone that someone else's hands shaped in a world that contained mammoths. The surface is cold and slightly rough, and the carving under your fingers is as precise as the day it was made. Because the fill that silenced the sight is also the reason the detail survived. Now ask the question that all of this makes unavoidable. Who were they covering it for? Not for themselves. The filling was thorough and final. There was no passage left unsealed. No marker above the surface to guide someone back to what lay beneath. Once the fill was in place and the surface was smooth, the enclosures were gone from the world that anyone living could reach. Not for their children. In any practical sense. A buried monument that requires excavating through millions of pounds of packed fill is not a resource the next generation can use on any ordinary timescale. Some researchers have proposed that preservation was not the intention at all. That the filling was a ritual act of closure, and the survival of the site is a consequence rather than a goal. That may well be true. The evidence is consistent with that interpretation. But whether the survival was intended or incidental, something was sent forward. Not a message in any code the recipients could read. The symbolic language of the carvings died with the last person who had been taught to use it. The meaning of the fox, and the snake, and the vulture, and the headless figure, and the carved arms on the central pillars did not travel through the darkness with the stone. What traveled was the stone itself. The fact of it. The scale of it. The evidence that someone at a time, almost impossibly remote, cared enough about something to move mountains to build it, and cared enough to move mountains again to cover it. That is what Klaus Schmidt found in the autumn of 1994. Not an answer. A question, placed in the ground in the only language that could survive that long, waiting for whoever would eventually stand on that hill with the tools and the patience to receive it. We are those people. We received the question. We are still, in the most honest sense, working on what it asks of us. Chapter 8. The excavation that will outlive everyone reading this. Klaus Schmidt once said, in an interview given during one of the middle seasons of excavation, that Göbekli Tepe was a site that punished impatience. He was not being dramatic. He was describing a practical reality that anyone who has spent time with the published reports quickly comes to understand. The site is large. The fill is dense. The standards of documentation that responsible excavation requires are exacting. And the proportion of the total site that has been excavated at any given moment is a number that changes with agonizing slowness relative to the public appetite for answers. Schmidt began excavating in 1995. By the time he died in 2014, he had given nearly 2 decades of sustained effort to the site and had cleared and documented 4 major enclosures and portions of several others. What he had excavated represented somewhere between 5 and 10% of the total site. The geophysical surveys he commissioned during his tenure had identified the signatures of at least 15 to 20 additional enclosures still underground. Some of them showing dimensions that suggested they might be larger than anything yet uncovered. He knew, with the particular clarity of a man who had given his working life to a single question, that he would not live to see what those signatures contained. He excavated anyway. Carefully, precisely, publishing his findings in peer-reviewed literature and resisting the constant pressure from journalists and documentary filmmakers and the enormous global public that had discovered Göbekli Tepe and wanted answers delivered on a schedule that had nothing to do with what the evidence could actually support. That pressure was real and sustained throughout Schmidt's tenure at the site. Every few years, a new wave of popular attention would arrive, driven by a documentary or a magazine feature or a book, and with it would come the same questions, asked with the same urgency. What does it mean? Who built it? Why did they bury it? What does it tell us about the origins of civilization, or religion, or human consciousness? When will you know? Schmidt answered carefully and precisely, and without the dramatic certainty that the questions were looking for. He was not always thanked for the care. The excavation has continued under the direction of the German Archaeological Institute and in collaboration with Turkish authorities since his death. With researchers, including Lee Clare, taking leading roles in the ongoing work, the pace has not changed. The standards have not changed. The proportion of the site that has been excavated has grown, but it remains a fraction of the whole. And researchers often cite estimates suggesting that fully exploring the site at the pace of careful scientific excavation could take approximately 150 years from the present. That figure should be understood as a rough projection rather than a precise calculation. But even as a projection, it carries weight. The doctoral students who will write the final chapters of Göbekli Tepe have not yet been born. The questions that the last seasons of excavation will answer are questions that no one living today has yet learned to ask. Because the evidence that will generate those questions is still in the dark. This is what it looks like when a site is taken seriously. Archaeological excavation is a destructive process. When you remove a deposit from the ground, you permanently alter the spatial relationships between the objects in that deposit. Relationships that may carry information no subsequent analysis can recover. The only way to preserve that information is to document it exhaustively before disturbing it. And exhaustive documentation takes time. A single square meter of densely occupied stratigraphy, excavated to the standard the German Archaeological Institute maintains at Göbekli Tepe, can require days or weeks of careful work. Schmidt understood this at a level that shaped every decision he made at the site. It is visible in every page of his published reports, in the precision of his descriptions, in the care with which he distinguished observation from interpretation, in the consistency with which he held the line between what the evidence showed and what he might have wished it to show. He held that line under considerable pressure for nearly 2 decades, without yielding to the easier and more popular version of the story that the site could have been made to tell. That is a form of intellectual courage that deserves to be named. What has been found in the years since Schmidt's death has continued to expand and complicate the picture he spent his career developing. Excavations at the related site of Karahan Tepe, located approximately 23 miles southeast of Göbekli Tepe, and part of the broader complex of pre-pottery Neolithic monumental sites, now collectively referred to as the Taş Tepeler, or stone hills. Have revealed T-shaped pillars and carved imagery, sharing significant characteristics with Göbekli Tepe, while displaying distinct features suggesting regional variation within a broader shared tradition. Karahan Tepe has produced carved human heads emerging from walls and floors in ways that have no direct parallel at Göbekli Tepe, suggesting that the builders of these sites were producing distinct expressions of a common tradition rather than identical copies. The Taş Tepeler project, supported by the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism and involving multiple Turkish and international research teams, has identified and begun investigating more than a dozen sites in the region, sharing characteristics with Göbekli Tepe. The scope of the monumental construction tradition that the site represents is considerably larger than anyone understood even 15 years ago. And then, in September of 2025, something was found at Göbekli Tepe that no previous season of excavation had produced. The Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism announced the discovery of a life-sized human statue embedded horizontally in the base of a wall between two of the enclosures. The announcement was reported by Archaeology magazine on the 29th of September, 2025, citing the ministry directly. The statue is the first of its kind found at the site. Every previous representation of the human form at Göbekli Tepe had been either the abstracted T-shaped pillars with their carved arms and hands, or the smaller human figures depicted in relief on pillar surfaces. A life-sized freestanding human figure is a categorically different kind of object. Its position, embedded horizontally at the base of a wall in what researchers have described as a votive context, raises questions that will require careful analysis to begin addressing. What the discovery makes immediately clear is that the site has not finished surprising the people who work on it. After 30 years of excavation, after hundreds of scholarly papers and the investment of careers by multiple generations of researchers, after becoming one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, after all of that, Göbekli Tepe produced an object that no one anticipated. That is what it means to have 90% of a site still underground. Somewhere in that unseen majority, there are things waiting that will matter, as much as anything already found. Schmidt knew this. He wrote about it. He understood that the site he had given his life to was, by any honest accounting, still mostly unknown. He excavated anyway, carefully, precisely, one layer at a time. That is the only way this kind of work gets done. Chapter 9. The theories we should take seriously, and the ones we should not. There is a test that any serious claim about Göbekli Tepe has to pass. The test is not whether the claim is interesting. Many interesting claims have been made about this site, and some of the most interesting have turned out to be unsupported by evidence. Interest is not a standard. Excitement is not a standard. The feeling that a particular interpretation would make a compelling story is emphatically not a standard. The standard is evidence. Specifically, evidence collected with documented methodology, subjected to peer review, and found to be consistent with the broader body of findings at the site and at related sites in the region. That standard does not produce certainty. Archaeology rarely produces certainty. What it produces is a range of conclusions, with varying degrees of support. From the well-established findings that the field has reached near consensus on, to the serious but contested hypotheses that active researchers are currently debating, to the speculative proposals that have some basis in evidence but have not been confirmed, to the claims that have no basis in the evidence at all and persist only because they are exciting or because they serve an agenda that has nothing to do with understanding the past. All four categories exist in the literature and the popular culture surrounding Göbekli Tepe. Treating them as equivalent, or failing to distinguish between them, is not open-mindedness. It is a failure of responsibility that ultimately disrespects the people who built the site, because it substitutes stories we want to tell about them for the harder work of understanding what they actually left behind. Begin with what the evidence firmly supports. The site was built by communities living primarily by hunting and gathering, before the large-scale adoption of settled agriculture in the region. This is supported by radiocarbon dates, by analysis of animal bones showing exclusively wild species, by the absence of domestic plant remains in the early phases of occupation, and by the broader archaeological context of the pre-pottery Neolithic in southeastern Turkey. The researchers whose work supports this conclusion include Klaus Schmidt, Joris Peters, Laura Dietrich, Oliver Dietrich, Jens Nortroff, and Lee Clare, all of whom have published in peer-reviewed journals with documented methodology. The site required organized collective labor, implying social coordination well beyond what small individual bands could sustain. This follows from basic calculations about pillar weight and fill volume, confirmed by experimental archaeology. It is not disputed by any serious researcher. The enclosures appear to have been intentionally filled over time, through a process more complex than any single phrase fully captures. This is based on stratigraphic analysis conducted across decades of careful excavation. The full character of that process is still being understood. But the conclusion that the filling was not the result of natural accumulation is firmly established. The site's location is close to the genetic origin zone of domestic einkorn wheat, and the site shows evidence of large-scale cereal processing consistent with communal gatherings. These findings form the evidential basis of the serious hypothesis that the organizational demands of Göbekli Tepe may have contributed to the agricultural transition. The hypothesis has genuine support. It has not been proven to the satisfaction of all researchers in the field. That distinction matters. Now move to the contested middle ground. The astronomical hypothesis, most prominently represented by the 2017 paper of Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, proposes that imagery at the site encodes records of astronomical events. The direct scholarly response from Nortroff, Dietrich, and Clare identified methodological problems that have not been resolved, and the hypothesis has not achieved acceptance in the mainstream archaeological literature on the site. Astronomical awareness among the builders is a reasonable general inference from the site's architecture and orientation. The specific claim that Pillar 43 encodes a precisely dated cosmic event is not currently supported to the standard archaeological claims require. Both of those statements are true, and neither cancels the other. The theory that Göbekli Tepe was the single origin point of organized religion, or the direct template from which all subsequent religious architecture descended, is an interpretive claim that goes beyond what the evidence directly supports. The site almost certainly served ritual functions, and the tradition it represents clearly influenced later developments in the region. The specific claim of direct causal descent to the religious traditions of the broader ancient world is not something the record can currently establish. Now, come the claims that do not pass the evidentiary test. The proposal that Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors of a lost advanced civilization. 1. Possessing technology or knowledge beyond anything the pre-pottery Neolithic record shows, has no support in the archaeological evidence. The construction techniques used, while genuinely impressive, are consistent with what skilled hunter-gatherers using stone tools and organized collective labor could achieve. There is no artifact at the site, no tool, no material, no structural element that requires a more technologically advanced builder to explain. The claim rests on the premise that hunter-gatherers could not have built this. 30 years of excavation and experimental archaeology have consistently shown that premise to be wrong. The proposal that the site was built with assistance from extraterrestrial beings requires no serious engagement. There is no evidence for it. Its only appeal is the appeal that such theories always carry. The appeal of explaining something impressive by attributing it to a power that is by definition, beyond any requirement to produce supporting evidence. The claim that the T-shaped pillars constitute a lost writing system, encoding linguistic information in the way that hieroglyphics or cuneiform encode language, is an attractive idea the evidence does not currently support. The distribution of signs across different surfaces and enclosures does not match the statistical patterns that linguists and cryptographers use to identify writing systems. The symbols are meaningful. They are not, as far as current analysis can determine, a writing system in the linguistic sense. There is one more category worth addressing, because it is subtler than the others. The claim that Göbekli Tepe requires a complete rewrite of human history is an overstatement that does a disservice to both the site and the field. What Göbekli Tepe does is extend the demonstrated capacity for organized monumental construction back several thousand years earlier than previously documented. That is a significant revision. It is not a demolition of the standard model. Agriculture still happened. Writing still developed. The trajectory of human civilization that the standard model describes still occurred. What changed is our understanding of what preceded that trajectory and what human beings were capable of before it began. That change is genuinely important. It does not require revolutionary rhetoric to be taken with the seriousness it deserves. The careful work of Schmidt and his colleagues has produced a picture of Göbekli Tepe that is more remarkable than any of the unsupported theories that have attached themselves to the site. The truth is stranger and more interesting and more consequential than the inventions. A community of hunters, living before agriculture, built the oldest monumental architecture in the world. They fed each other from stone vessels and maintained carved pillars whose meaning we have not yet recovered, and organized labor on a scale that the standard model said was impossible at that period and in that way. And then they covered it all, with apparent intention, with enormous effort, with a thoroughness that preserved it across a distance of time we still struggle to feel. That is the story the evidence tells. It does not need embellishment. It needs only to be told honestly, with the care and precision that the people who built it and the people who have spent their lives uncovering it both deserve. Chapter 10. What Göbekli Tepe does to the story we tell ourselves. There is a story that civilization tells about itself. It is a story about progress, about the long climb from simple to complex, from scattered and vulnerable to organized and powerful. It is a story with a clear direction, each generation building on the foundations laid by its predecessors, the whole arc of human experience moving, slowly but unmistakably, toward something more than what came before. It is a comforting story. And like most comforting stories, it is partly true and partly a simplification that serves our need for narrative more than it serves our actual understanding of what happened. Göbekli Tepe does not destroy that story, but it changes the ground it stands on in ways that matter, quietly and permanently. The change is not primarily about dates. Though the dates are striking, it is not primarily about scale. Though the scale of what was built by people we had underestimated is genuinely humbling. The change is something more fundamental. It is a change in what we think the baseline of human capability actually is. The standard story assumed a baseline. Before agriculture, before writing, before the infrastructure of what we call civilization, human beings operated at a level of social and cognitive complexity that made certain things possible and other things not yet within reach. That baseline was where the story started. Everything above it was the record of human achievement. Everything below it was prehistory, which is another way of saying before the story we know how to tell begins. Göbekli Tepe places a monument at the baseline. Not a suggestion of complexity. Not an ambiguous finding that might indicate social organization slightly beyond what was expected. A monument. Massive. Deliberate. Sophisticated. Maintained across centuries. Covered with intention. a monument that required the same fundamental human capacities that all subsequent monuments have required. The ability to organize collective effort around a shared purpose, to sustain that organization across generations, to encode meaning in physical form and transmit it forward in time. Those capacities were present at the baseline, which means they were present before the baseline, because the skills required to build Göbekli Tepe are not invented overnight. They are the product of generations of accumulated practice. The tradition that produced this site had its own history, a history that predates Göbekli Tepe, that is largely invisible to us because the earlier phases have not survived in recoverable form, or have not yet been found, or lie under landscapes that have not been systematically surveyed. But that history existed, and if it existed, then the question of what else existed in that same period, in other parts of the world, in conditions that may or may not have preserved any recoverable trace, becomes considerably more urgent than it was before that autumn afternoon in 1994. Consider the coastlines. When the glaciers of the last ice age held so much of the world's water frozen in their mass, sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. The coastlines of that world, the places where land met sea, where marine resources were richest and communication by water was easiest. Those coastlines are now underwater. They have been underwater for between 8,000 and 10,000 years. Those drowned coastlines are exactly where we would expect ancient peoples to have concentrated. They offered food, manageable climate, and the kind of movement along the shore that connects communities to each other in the way that rivers and coasts have always connected human settlements. If there were other communities in that world with the organizational capacity of the people who built Göbekli Tepe, some of them were almost certainly living on coastlines that no one alive today has ever seen. Underwater archaeology is a young discipline with tools that are still developing. The vast majority of those drowned coastlines remain essentially unexplored. Consider the Sahara. Now, one of the most hostile environments on Earth, it was a different place during the African humid period, which lasted from approximately 11,000 to 5,000 years before the present. A wetter climate supported grasslands, lakes, rivers, and large human populations across what is now empty desert. The peoples of the Green Sahara left traces at sites like Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, where stone alignments suggest communal ritual practice and astronomical awareness, predating the first Egyptian dynasties by millennia. As the Sahara dried, those populations moved toward the Nile Valley. And what they built and knew and practiced during the millennia when the desert was green is largely unknown to us, buried under centuries of sand in a landscape that remains among the most challenging on Earth for archaeological fieldwork. Consider the Amazon. Long assumed to be a pristine wilderness, sparsely inhabited by small nomadic groups, it has in recent years begun revealing evidence of substantial pre-Columbian complexity. LiDAR technology has uncovered networks of earthworks, roads, and platforms across enormous areas of the basin that were completely invisible to conventional survey. Research published in the journal Science in January of 2024, led by archaeologist Stephen Rostain of France's National Center for Scientific Research, described a network of interconnected urban sites in Ecuador's Upano Valley, more than 2,500 years old, spanning over 300 kilometers. Researchers now estimate that between 10,000 and 24,000 pre-Columbian earthworks may exist throughout the Amazon basin, the vast majority still unmapped and unstudied. Each of these silences is different. The drowned coastlines are silent because the sea rose. The Green Sahara is silent because the desert came. The Amazon was silent because epidemic disease arrived before systematic archaeology did. And the populations that had built and maintained those landscapes were gone before anyone thought to look carefully at what they had left behind. What all of these silences share is this: they are gaps in the sample. not gaps in the reality. The story we have been telling about human civilization is a story built on the evidence that survived and was found in the places where survival and discovery were most likely. It is not a story built on everything that existed. What existed was larger. What existed included capabilities and forms of social complexity that the standard story placed much later in the sequence, or did not include at all, because the evidence for them was buried under sand and sea and jungle canopy and the accumulated weight of everything that followed. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not waiting for history to begin. They were not civilization in the later urban sense, with its writing and cities and standing institutions and accumulated formal knowledge, but they already possessed many of the human capacities that would make civilization possible. The capacity to organize, to build, to maintain shared purpose across generations, to encode meaning in physical form, to decide what was worth preserving, and to do the work that preserving it required. Those capacities were not invented by the first farmers. They were brought to the first farmers by people who had developed them in a world we are only beginning to recover. Göbekli Tepe is where that understanding stopped being philosophical and became physical. You can stand next to the pillars. You can put your hand on the stone. And in the cold roughness of that surface under your fingers, you can feel the presence of people who were already, by any honest measure, fully human in every capacity that word implies. Who looked at the sky the way we look at the sky? Who felt the weight of the questions that the sky does not answer? Who built something to hold those questions? Something large enough and careful enough and detailed enough to be worthy of them. And who covered it over when its time was done, and went on with their lives, and died, and were forgotten so completely that 12,000 years later a man drove out to look at their hill and did not know until he put his hand on the shaped limestone at the surface that anything was there. The story is being revised, season by season, layer by layer. On the hill above the Heron Plain, every site that LiDAR finds under jungle canopy, every artifact a fishing trawler pulls from the floor of the North Sea, every buried enclosure a ground-penetrating radar survey identifies in the hills of southeastern Turkey, every season of excavation that produces something no one anticipated. All of it is the same revision. All of it is the story making room for the people it left out. They have been waiting a long time to be included. Chapter 11. Closing. Come back to the hill. Not the hill, as it is now, with its excavated enclosures and protective shelters and visitor pathways and its designation on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The hill as it was for almost all of its existence. Rounded and quiet against the sky above the Heron Plain. Unremarkable. From a distance. Indistinguishable. To any eye that did not know what to look for. From the dozens of other limestone ridges rising above the flat agricultural land of southeastern Turkey. For a span of time that contains the entire recorded history of the human species more than twice over, people walked past that hill without knowing what was inside it. Farmers plowed the fields at its base. Shepherds crossed its slopes. Villages rose and fell on the plain below. Empires claimed the territory. Languages came and went. Religions whose founders would not be born for thousands of years after the hill was covered, spread across the region and left their own marks on the landscape. And underneath all of it, in the dark, in the silence, in the perfect patience of stone, the carved figures waited. The fox frozen mid-turn on its pillar. The snakes in their long spiraling descent. The vulture with its outstretched wings over the headless figure below. The carved arms running down the flanks of the central pillars of enclosure D, suggesting a body that the stone held in abstraction rather than depicting directly. All of it waited, the way stone waits, which is to say completely, and without effort, and without the possibility of impatience, for exactly as long as the waiting required. Then, in the autumn of 1994, a man drove out to a hilltop near Sanliurfa and walked the surface and recognized the shaped limestone and understood that what he was standing on was not a medieval cemetery. Klaus Schmidt spent the next 20 years of his life with what he had found. He excavated carefully and published honestly and held the line. Season after season, between what the evidence showed and what the pressures of public attention wanted it to show, he understood that the site was giving him fragments. He understood that the fragments were extraordinary. And he understood, with the clarity that comes from giving the best years of your working life to a single question, that the full answer was still underground. He died in 2014 at 60 years old. The site was still 90% underground. That is not a tragedy in any ordinary sense. That is what it looks like when a person takes a question seriously enough to work on it without expecting to finish it. Schmidt knew when he began that he would not finish. He excavated anyway. Carefully, precisely, one layer at a time, making the record as accurate and as useful as he could for the researchers who would come after him. The work continues. Other careful hands are removing other layers of fill from the same hill where Schmidt first recognized the shaped limestone. The geophysical surveys have shown what lies ahead. At least 15 to 20 more enclosures are in the dark, some possibly larger than anything yet uncovered. And in September of 2025, 30 years after Schmidt drove out to look at the hill, a life-sized human statue emerged from the base of a wall between two enclosures, the first of its kind at the site, embedded horizontally, in what researchers have described as a votive position, placed with intention at a threshold whose meaning we do not yet understand. After 30 years, after all the seasons of careful work and all the published analyses and all the questions asked and partially answered, still surprising. That is the nature of 90%. Here is what we know. 12,000 years ago, on a limestone ridge above a plain in what is now southern Turkey, people built something extraordinary without the tools and infrastructure we assumed were necessary. They built it because they needed to, for reasons that are not fully recoverable but that are visible in the scale and care and sustained commitment of what they left behind. They used it for centuries. They fed each other from stone vessels and maintained carved pillars whose meaning we have not yet recovered, and organized gatherings that drew people from distances we have not yet fully measured. And then, through a process that was more complex than any simple phrase can capture, but that was almost certainly not accidental, they covered it. With care. With effort. With the same organized purpose that had built it. The act of ending became the act of preservation. And the preservation became, across a distance of time that contains all of recorded history and then some, the act of discovery. And the discovery became, in the hands of Klaus Schmidt and the researchers who followed him, the beginning of a revision to a story we thought we already knew. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not waiting for history to begin. They were not primitive ancestors standing at the threshold of everything that would eventually make us who we are, passive and unformed, waiting for conditions to improve. They were already something. They organized and built and maintained and made meaning in stone and decided what was worth preserving and did the enormous work that preserving it required. They were fully human, in every capacity that the word implies. Before we had a word for it, before we had a story that included them, the story is being revised, layer by layer, season by season, one careful brush stroke at a time, on the hill above the Heron Plain, in laboratories where stone is being analyzed, in archives where Schmidt's field notes are being read by researchers who were not yet born when he wrote them. The revision is not finished. It will not be finished in our lifetimes. But the direction has been clear since the autumn of 1994. When a man drove out to look at a hill that everyone else had driven past, he stopped. He looked. He recognized the shaped limestone. And the hill, which had been holding its question for 12,000 years, began at last to give it up, one layer at a time, with the patience it had always had. Let that be what carries you into sleep tonight. Not the unsolved mysteries. Not the unread symbols. Not the unanswered question of why they covered what they built. Just the image of a man stopping at a hill that everyone else had driven past. Stopping. And looking. And recognizing. And the hill, after all that time, beginning to answer. Sleep well. The work continues tonight. The hill is still there. And somewhere in the dark beneath it, in the fill that careful hands packed so long ago around the things they most wanted to hold, something is waiting that will matter. It has been waiting a long time. A little longer will not trouble it at all. Good night.